Hello everyone. We basically do not expect sensory memories and short-term memories to remain with us for a long time. But when we deliberately encode and store information in the long-term memory, we want it to stay there. Why do we forget long-term memories? The more you know about how we lose memories, the better you will be able to hang on them. So let's begin our today's video. Forgetting is a complete or a past loss of information stored in the long-term memory. It is a failure to retrieve information from long-term memory store. Much of the information is lost, but enough remains so that we have a sketchy record of our lives. Sometimes we think it is forgotten in real sense, but it is not forgotten because it was never been encoded and stored in the first place. Many people complain that they do not remember the contents after attending the topics or forget after reading the text. This happens due to lack of attention. Some information does not reach the short-term memory from the sensory register or due to inadequate encoding and rehearsal. The information may not have been transferred from short-term to long-term memory. Information was not stored in the long-term memory because rehearsal was not sufficiently elaborative in nature. Many a times we forget as memory does not match events which had occurred. This happens due to the constructive processes, that is, during encoding, things to be remembered regarding different kinds of informations, especially if it is complex life events or sometimes we have read is modified. Certain details are accentuated, the materials may be simplified or may be changed in many other ways, so that what is encoded and stored is far from a literal copy of the input. Constructive process of encoding distorts which stored in the memory and distortions are remembered. We remember the gist or meaning of what we have read or heard, but not the actual words themselves. Inferences constructed at the time the information was encoded for storage is remembered, or portions of encoded information are thus being remembered by an individual. The past 100 years of memory research has seen several psychological explanations for forgetting. Some theories about forgetting have been very specific concerning the decay of the memory trace, brain damage or disease motivated forgetting, or interference from other materials. In other cases, the reasons why we forget are to do with other characteristics of memory. There is a considerable amount of work, for instance, which shows how important context cues and processings are for remembering. And so forgetting can be sometimes be seen as arising from inadequacy in this respect. The most common conceptualization of forgetting has been that it is caused by interference. Originally learned materials cannot be reproduced. They are forgotten because in the meanwhile the new responses got associated with the old stimuli. These subsequently learned responses interfere with the recall of the old ones, and thus forgetting is due to a subsequent learning of new materials. In some situations, the learning of one set of verbal material interferes with the ability to recall another set, and such interference is a major cause of forgetting of verbal information. Imagine that you learn a list of 20 words and you are then asked to learn another list of another 20 more words. Now try to remember the first list. Learning the second list has probably made it more difficult to recall the first list to some extent. You have also forgotten which words are in the which list. The interference theory of forgetting might best be described as a theory of confusion. An individual has learned numerous responses and gets them mixed up using more conventional behaviorist terminology. Verbal learning theories called this phenomenon response as competition. Crowding of response tendencies, competition and conflict among them. Stimulus and response generalization and resulting confusions are used as explanatory notes or spices to principles in interference theory, forgetting. There may be blocking of memory in account of conflicting associations. Retroactive inhibition is held as the paradigm or conceptualization for the proper understanding of forgetting. The reason of this emphasis is not far to seek. Of a large amount of forgetting can be produced in the laboratory by interpolating them and controllable activities between the original learning and its subsequent recall, thus illustrating the best tradition of experimentation. Quite understandably, therefore, retroaction has been hailed in the past as the best explanation of forgetting. However, it is useful to know that the retroactive inhibition interpretation has its limitations, as the adverse effect upon retention of activity interpolated between learning and recall is still about the best definitions of the concept of retroactive inhibition. The classical retroactive inhibition paradigm provides out the only typical illustrative interference. However, the adverse effect of activity occurs even when it is just similar to without involving specifically conflicting. Obviously, retroactive inhibition interpretation all instances of forgetting. Retroactive inhibition formulations demands similarity between the original and interpolated learning in real life activities, which bear no correspondence of similarity. A major inadequacy of retroactive interference perhaps is its inability to account for the usual shaping of forgetting. Why should interference respond to retention loss in the beginning, and in some it is slower the decrease afterwards? However, the general interference position has accommodated further improvements and to customize that it can handle more facts, more adequate accumulation of substantial experimental evidence's recent origin, and a spirited plea of underwaved conceded that forgetting may be brought out towards a conflicting association, which have been acquisitioned in a lesson-wise in questions is learned. Thus, the proactive learning has been admitted as an additional source of recognition that forgetting can be brought out through interfering associations in learned either prior to or the task under which is considerative in nature. A very definite relationship that has emerged from the experiments on proactive inhibition is that greater the number of prior lessons an individual has studied and remembered, the faster is the forgetting of the tasks learned last. Heavy proactive inhibitions accumulates even when there is no formal similarity between the S and R constituents of the series which is learned successively within the laboratory. The basic mechanisms of interference can best be appreciated if we remember that it was developed to account for the forgetting of list of paired verbal units, which account in case of two sets of interference of mechanisms. The first set is addressed essentially to considerations of how an organism might get mixed up, about which environmental events belongs to which memory. In case of humans, learned two lists of the kind just described, this mix-up might occur as response competition. Although two responses have been paired with the same stimulus words, one pairing occurring in the first list and another in the second list, only one response can be given if only one list is tested for retention. So if the incorrect response happens to be dominant at the moment of the test, forgetting is basically inferred in nature. Retroproactive inhibits are in fact the negative transfer effects of the interpolate task of the subsequent learning on the previous original learning, or the previous task on the subsequent original learning. Such inhibition effects cause interference in the fixation or consolidation of original learning materials and thus cause transferring to the memories, which as a result leads towards suffering. The anti-consolidation or the theory of the preservation is just opposite of consolidation or fixation. According to this theory, the after effects of the activity of learning persist even when learning trials have stopped. The persistence or perseverance of the after effects or traces leads to their consolidation, basically, or stabilization, and thus the traces are fixated. Being stabilized, they are likely to be retained longer and are better being remembered. When the original learning is immediately followed by different kinds of learning activity, interpolated activity, then it creates obstruction in the process of stabilization. It destabilizes the process of consolidation of the after effects traces of the original learning. In other words, the interpolated learning materials function as anti-consolidation of the original learning traced, or we may say it prevents the consolidation of the original learning. Therefore, the trace of the original learning are weakened and result in poor recall or loss of memory. This does not happen when original learning is followed by relaxation that permits the persistence and thereby consolidation of the original learning traces thus do occur. The theory of preservation is basically based on the fundamental principle of mental inertia. According to this principle, any nervous activity persists for some time even when the stimulus that has aroused the new real activity is basically being removed. Technically, this is called as the terminal lag of a neural process. Such a phenomenon is evidenced from the occurrence of after sensation. Example, if you keep looking at a particular stimulus, say a green patch, and turn your eyes to a white surface, you may experience a dim patch of green on the white surface. This is called after sensation, which happens due to persistence of the effect of original sensation even when the same ceases. In this context, we should also understand the difference between terminal lag and initial lag. Initial lag is a neural process which is different from the terminal lag, and it refers to the neural process which is different from the terminal lag, and it refers to the neural application that takes some time to build up after the application of the stimulus. Basically, experiments on after response time represents an example of the initial lag, in which sometimes elapses between the onset of a particular stimulus and responding to the particular stimulus. And this law of mental inertia is also called as the law of preservation of mental energy. This fundamental law, along with the assumptions about memory traces, supply the basic anti-consolidation theory of informations, in which the response inertia theories are supposed to be the cause of towards obstructions by an interpolated activity that prevents or inhibits the consolidation of the after effects or the traces of the original learning.